I want to tell you some things which are a bit awful, so hold me hard. I woke up early this morning, and when I opened the shutters, the full round sun was just risen. I bounded back into bed. The bound made me cough. I spat. It tasted strange. It was bright red blood. Oh, yes, of course I'm frightened. I don't want to be ill. I mean seriously. Away from Jack. Jack is the first thought. Second, I don't want to find this is real consumption. Perhaps it's going to gallop. Who knows? And I shan't have my work written. That's what matters. How unbearable it would be to die. Leave, scraps, bits. Nothing real finished.
She had completed the story Je ne parle pas français before her hemorrhage. It took 3 days. She now began Bliss.
It's 3 o'clock. I've just finished this new story, Bliss. My God, I have enjoyed writing it.
Catherine's conversations were legendary, but as the separations from Murray and her friends lengthened, letters became a form of personal conversations. She wrote several letters a day. In the 3 months she was at Bundall, she wrote over 70 letters to Murray alone.
Dear Jack, I know quite well that you must be faithful to England, but all the same, we will have to have 2 homes. And we shall have all our babies in pairs, so that we possess a complete set in either place. Oh, why haven't I got a letter? I want one now. This minute, not tomorrow. I lie in bed all morning until 12, and go to bed again as soon as dinner is over. The interval I spend in going for a very small walk and in working. I have begun, thank God, to work a bit. I read it from the beginning to the end, and then from the end to the beginning. I ate it, breathed it, and finally fell out of bed and saw that the day was blue and the sun was shining.
I think the reason she's attracted so many women readers is that when she writes in her journal, in her letters, about what she actually wants in life, one feels an enormous response to that she wants something quite simple. She wants a home and a garden and music and pictures, and she wants love, and she wants to be able to work. And these are the absolutely fundamental things, and she expresses them very simply and very directly.
Catherine returned to London for the English summer. She was 1.5 stone lighter. She and Murray leased the Elephant overlooking Hampstead Heath. It was the nearest they came to having a home, and it was the longest they were to live anywhere. Her divorce from George Bowden was finally through, and on the 3rd of May, she and Murray were married. But the dream that Catherine wrote about of a home and children was never to be. Murray seemed preoccupied with his own career and emotionally distant. And she learned from her doctor that the arthritic pains that had plagued her for years were from a gonorrhea infection contracted back in 1910. It was now certain that she would never have a child. Simply going out exhausted her. And on her 30th birthday, she was told by 2 specialists that her consumption was so serious, if she didn't go into a sanatorium and have a complete rest, she'd be dead in 2 or 3 years. But she'd have to give up her writing. She refused, and Murray agreed. From now on, LM would become a permanent fixture in her life.
There was, you might say, a kind of triangle, and LM was an indispensable part of that triangle. LM was, for Catherine, something of a mother figure, a companion, someone who truly loved her. So Catherine had those 2 sources of love. Murray's love, which Catherine sometimes found faulty, found lacking. LM's love, which she never found lacking. And then there was the purely practical side of things. As Catherine grew sicker and grew weaker, she hadn't any physical energy, and she found it very difficult to do things for herself, difficult to dress herself, to put her clothes away, to organize the servants, to cook her food. And LM really was her wife.
Catherine left again for the Mediterranean. From now on, she would live almost permanently abroad, restlessly shifting, searching for an ideal climate for her health. Murray had recently been appointed the editor of a prestigious literary magazine, the Athenaeum, which was a major step in his career. And so it was decided that LM would stay with Catherine. Murray would help to settle them in, then he would return to London. She first moved to Ospedaletti, an Italian town close to the French border. There she tried to come to terms with the seriousness of her illness. Resenting her increasing dependence on LM, she felt abandoned by her husband. And as the winter storms hit the Mediterranean, she struggled with death and despair.
These are the worst days of my whole life. Where is my mate? I lie retracing my steps, going over all the old life before. The baby of Garnet's love. Black. The days spent in hell. Unable to do anything. Took brandy. Determined not to weep. Wept. A sense of isolation frightful. I shall die if I don't escape. Nauseated. Faint. Cold with misery. Oh, I must survive it somehow.
Catherine left Ospedaletti. In Italy, tuberculosis was a notifiable disease. Accommodation was difficult, household help impossible, and no one would call. The proprietor of one hotel, after asking her to leave, fumigated her room, burnt her bedding, then sent her the bill. Catherine moved to France, to the town of Menton, which would be home to her for the next 2 years. Reputed to have the sunniest climate on the Mediterranean, it had become a popular health resort, especially for the English. It was known as the Salon d'Azur, and each year thousands of ailing tourists would winter over in Menton, many of them consumptives. Catherine rented the Isola Bella, and LM joined her. Slowly, her spirit recovered, but she still suffered frequent fevers. And although she could manage a short walk each day with the aid of a stick, most of her time was spent resting on this terrace, reading, writing. It was the beginning of the most creative period of her life. She wrote 7 stories at Isola Bella, including The Daughters of the Late Colonel.
She started downstairs, and then she felt she got very tired. She was very weak, must come to bed. And the story was ramping through her mind. She even stopped on the stairs and sat down to put down the next sentence. Then she came up and went on writing. I should think it was about 2 in the morning. She called out she'd finished. And I went in, and she was folding up the letters, and the pages, and putting them together and going through. And she'd signed her name. She always did. When she was freeze, when she knew the thing was complete, to the last comma, the last full stop. The dawn was coming through the windows, shining through the mimosa tree, and the sky was getting just light, just pale. And we said, what about a cup of tea? So I went down and made her a cup of tea, and then she said, shall I read it to you? It's about you. And so she then and there read it through to me at once.
The awareness of death, the awareness of the closeness of death, made her see life as something marvelous, as something beautiful, as something to be treasured. And so every little detail of the bird in the garden, of the flower on the tree, became something marvelous, and it almost has a mystical significance, a spiritual significance.
In fact, I love it as I've never loved any place but my home. And you know what that means. My small, pale yellow house with a mimosa tree growing in front of it, just a bit deeper yellow. The garden full of plants. The terrace with crumbling yellow pillars, covered with green, all belonging to a picture or a story. Every morning I have a sea water bath in a saucer. And today, after it's still wet, I stood in the full sun to dry. Both windows wide open. One can't help walking about naked in the mornings. One almost wades in the air.
Murray joined her for Christmas.
The weather is superb, and the champagne only 30 francs a bottle. Champagne in this air and this sun is unsafe for all people under, say, 99. Queer it is. I believe if I lived in England, I could be a eunuch quite cheerfully, but there's something in the air of France which is very restorative, let's say.
Catherine had faced a spiritual crisis at Ospedaletti, and she felt that Murray had not given her the support she needed. She was now searching for a new principle on which to base her life.
Everything in life that we really accept undergoes a change. So suffering must become love. This is the mystery. This is what I must do. I must pass from personal love, which has failed me, to greater love.
Contrary to popular opinion, Menton was not always the miracle cure. And medical opinion was now divided as to whether the climate of the French Mediterranean was in fact beneficial to tuberculosis or not. In spite of the sea and the sun, Catherine remained as frail as when she arrived. Her spate of writing had exhausted her. It was reaching new heights of maturity and assurance. It was being readily accepted for publication. But her health was still holding her back. Losing faith in Menton, she now turned to a very different climate in search of a cure, one which would ultimately make no difference to her health, but would provide an important new stimulus to her writing.
All our flags are pinned on Switzerland. Meadows, trees, mountains, and kind air. I hope we shall get there in time.
Catherine had heard about a tuberculosis treatment at the village of Montana, high in the Swiss Alps. Murray joined her, giving up his job as literary editor in London. They rented a chalet, the Chalet Les Sapins, while LM found lodgings nearby.
At sunset, when all the clouds are really too much to bear alone, I call out, "Mountains on your right are deep blue." And M shouts from below, "Right." And I hear him go out on his balcony to observe. I really judge a place by how vividly I can recall the past. One lives in the past, or I do. And here, it is living.
This was the last home that the Murrays would have together. They seemed to reach a state of domestic contentment here. A brief Indian summer. The mornings they would write. In the afternoons they would read aloud to each other, play cribbage, or knit, both of them, and quite industriously it seems, for large quantities of wool were sent to them from London, along with their cat, Wingley, brought over from Hampstead to join them. And it was here, looking across to the Swiss Alps, that Catherine would write the most vivid stories of her New Zealand childhood. At the bay, the doll's house, the garden party.
You know, if the truth were known, I have a perfect passion for the island where I was born. Well, in the early morning there, I always remember feeling that this little island has dipped back into the dark blue sea during the night, only to rise again at the gleam of day, all hung with bright spangles and glittering drops. And just as on those mornings, white milky mists rise and uncover some beauty, and then smother it again, and then again disclose it. I tried to live that mist from my people, and let them be seen, and then to hide them again. New Zealand is in my very bones. What I wouldn't give to have a look at it.
Catherine never returned. Her mother, Annie Beecham, had died 3 years before. In a letter to a friend, she wrote of her daughter, "She has at last learned to love her mother and her father, and has written us adoring and adorable letters lately. Poor darling, she has missed so much in life, but it was all quite her own choosing." Despite the happiness of her time in Switzerland, Catherine had heard of a new possible cure for her tuberculosis, and she felt she had to move on. In January 1922, Catherine left Switzerland for Paris.
Do you know, I have not walked since November 1920. Not more than to a carriage and back. Both my lungs are affected. There is a cavity in one and the other is affected through. Can all this be cured? Ah, Kotiliansky, wish for me.
She would undergo a series of extensive and painful X-ray treatments. It would fail, but it would be the beginning of another journey, one she would have to make alone.
A new way of being is not an easy thing to live. I have to die to so much. I have to make such big changes. I feel the only thing to do is to get the dying over, to court it almost. Fearfully hard, that. And then all hands to the business of being born again. Haven't I been saying all along that the fault lies in trying to cure the body and paying no heed whatever to the sick psyche?
On October 16th, 2 days after her 34th birthday, Catherine entered the Gurdjieff Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man at Fontainebleau near Paris. Without her, Murray and LM tried to pick up the threads of their own lives.
Risk. Risk anything. Care no more for the opinions of others, for those voices. Do the hardest thing on earth for you. Act for yourself. Face the truth.
Catherine lived the last 3 months of her life with a group of some 60 adults and children, mostly Russian émigrés, and their teacher, Gurdjieff. They were building a community based on a personal philosophy of balancing and integrating the spiritual, mental, and physical aspects of the self. It was a return to simplicity, and for her, perhaps, family love.
That evening they had this feast, and a woman that was told to talk to me afterwards said it was quite astonishing. We all noticed her glowing beauty, as though she had reached right through to the cloud of loving that is all around us. And she seemed to have at last got in touch with the essential being of life.
In a note to Murray, written on New Year's Eve, she asked him to visit her. On the evening of the 9th of January, Katherine Mansfield sat by this fire. This place was always kept for her. She was watching a group of dancers. Murray, who had arrived that morning, sat with her. He found her pale, but radiant. At 10 p.m. they rose together to go to her room. She ran ahead of him gaily, almost skipping up the stairs, something she hadn't done for years. Suddenly she stopped and turned. She clutched her mouth, trying to stem the flow of arterial blood pulsing between her fingers. "I think I'm going to die," she said. Murray carried her to her room and went for help. She's still conscious. Her eyes are fixed on the door. Murray returns with 2 doctors who force him from the room.
All this sounds much too serious and dramatic. As a matter of fact, there is absolutely no tragedy in it, of course.